The Phillies make news off the field as they trade Pat Neshek to the Colorado Rockies for prospects, 3 prospects, in fact. And we're joined now by CSN Philly beat reporter for the Phillies pre and post. I see him on the field now before the game a lot. One of my good friends and a former colleague, Corey Seidman. Corey, welcome to the show. How are you, pal?
I'm great, Pete. Always good to talk to you, especially after such a notable night for the Phils.
As that game unfolded, and I thought to myself, well, this is perfect timing. Of course, this is why I scheduled Corey to be on Thursday. Plus, it's an off day. That doesn't hurt us well. Let's start with the news that happened the latest. And I thought it was interesting because I'm sure you were watching the broadcast, and they interviewed Pat Neshek during the ball game. I mean, that doesn't usually happen, that you interview a player during the ball game, but the nature of the broadcast was such, and then there Pat Neshek gets traded afterwards.
Yeah, Pat Neshek didn't seem to know that it was definitely going to be last night, but he was just relieved that this trade has finally been consummated. He thought it was going to go right up to the wire to Monday's 4 p.m. deadline. But, you know, he was clearly the Phillies' best trade chip. I mean, there was a huge market for him because he has a 1.12 ERA. It's the third lowest ERA of any reliever in baseball this season. And because of that, every contending team was in on Pat Neshek. Phillies GM Matt Klentak said last night that the Rockies were the first team to check in on Neshek, and they stayed consistent throughout the process. And they really need bullpen help beyond Greg Holland, their closer, who leads the majors in saves. So Neshek is a good fit out there. He goes right into a pennant race. And in exchange for him, the Phillies bring in, 3 young players who are potential lottery tickets. And, say what you will about the return, the fact that the Phillies were able to turn Pat Neshek, who they acquired from the Astros for nothing but cash considerations, into 3 players who, one day maybe one of these guys is able to help you out. You got to make that move every time.
Yeah, I thought you described that perfectly as lottery tickets on the postgame show when you talked about, look, none of these guys are top prospects. None of these guys are can't-miss prospects. But this is where I almost used this phrase, flip this house, flip this player. This is where the Phillies are doing it the right way when they get a guy in and then turn him into something.
Right, and so we've seen some pretty light returns so far in the trades that have gone down throughout Major League Baseball, and that's because right now it's a buyer's market. There are more teams looking to sell than there are looking to buy. So, for Pat Neshek, the Phillies bring in 3 guys. 2 of them are 20 years old. One of them is 23 years old. They get a starting pitching prospect. They get a relief prospect and a shortstop prospect. And the Phillies were actually targeting players that age in this trade and in all of their pre-deadline trades that they seek out, because they're in a roster crunch. They have several players they need to add to the 40-man roster after this season in order to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. That includes J.P. Crawford. It includes Rhys Hoskins. There's Jason Terrian, who's a big-time reliever for them right now at AAA, who they're probably going to want to get a look at over the next few weeks. He'll need to be added to the 40-man roster, as well as perhaps Tom Eshelman after this season, starting pitcher, and then anybody that they acquire via trade or free agency, a veteran player would have to be added to the 40. So they didn't want to further complicate that situation, so they were looking for players that age. So don't be surprised if in the Jeremy Hellickson trade that might happen, or the Howie Kendrick trade that's expected to happen, you see similarly aged players who are in single A.
Corey Seidman with us, CSN Phillies beat reporter. You see him on pre and post, and really a guy, in my observation, that knows a lot of the minor league players that are out there in the minor league systems too, not just the big league roster. In fact, last night on the postgame show, I know that there was some speculation, well, if Neshek's gone, who comes up next? And you had a name right at the top of your tongue. I don't remember the name, though. Maybe you could tell me again who that was.
Yeah, it's Jason Terrian, who is a French-Canadian reliever who's really burst onto the scene this year with the Phillies. He has a big fastball, and he has a wipeout slider, and those 2 pitches have allowed him to have just tremendous success this season at AA and at AAA. Combined, he has a 1.46 ERA, about 7 strikeouts for every walk. So this is the guy that I expect them to call up to replace Pat Neshek in the bullpen. I mean, he's a potential future setup man, perhaps a potential future closer. So, between Hector Neris, Luis Garcia, who's been a real revelation this year for the Phils, and Jason Terrian, even though the Phillies just traded away their best reliever in Pat Neshek, they're kind of setting something up that, could potentially be next year's 7, 8, 9 in whatever form.
Corey, Nick here. Aaron Nola went 6 innings last night and had 10 strikeouts, and the Phillies obviously beat the #1 team in the American League in the Houston Astros. Is Aaron Nola now flashing this potential he has to be a future number one starter for this team?
Oh, I think so, absolutely. When Aaron Nola was drafted, people said that he was more of a mid-rotation piece, and I think that was mainly because he was viewed as a fast riser. So, people were saying he might not be an ace, but he's going to make it through the system quickly, and that whole narrative took on a life of its own. But what we've seen lately out of Aaron Nola, and I wrote about this after his last start prior to last night, it kind of reminds me of the evolution of Cole Hamels, because when Cole Hamels first came up, he was a two-pitch pitcher. He threw a low 90s fastball and that great changeup, and for a while it made him very effective. But it wasn't until Hamels got real command of his curveball and until he added the cutter once Cliff Lee and Roy Halladay came here that he became this four-pitch monster that was able to really stifle teams. And right now, that's what Aaron Nola is. Over his last 7 starts, his opponents have hit 137 against his two-seam fastball. They've hit 170 against his four-seam fastball, 200 against his curve, and 269 against his changeup. So he has all 4 pitches really working right now. And he held that Astros lineup completely off balance last night. He was the first pitcher in the Astros' last 58 games to hold them scoreless over at least 6 innings. So, that's really saying something after what Nick Pivetta and Vince Velasquez did the previous 2 nights.
Now, when you look at the other younger guys on the team, possibly even some of the prospects that could be called up, who actually catches your eye aside from Aaron Nola that could possibly, showcase that they can be an entrenched starter for this team for the next, maybe 5 to 7, maybe in the next decade, so to speak, for the Phillies, either pitching or guys who are really raking the ball now?
Well, it's interesting to look at the Phillies farm system, especially, in light of the Astros coming to town this week. I wrote a column today at csnphilly.com. I talked to the Astros manager and general manager just about, comparing the rebuilds. And to me, the Phillies are much more comparable to like the 2014 Kansas City Royals than they are to this current Astros team. And the reason for that is the Phils don't have these game-changing talents like a Jose Altuve or a George Springer or a Dallas Keuchel. Instead, they have a quantity of players who are nice pieces and could, potentially turn into an all-star down the line. So, right now, Nick Williams definitely looks like a keeper. He has a beautiful swing, a lot of bat speed, a lot of foot speed. So he looks like he's a guy that's going to be a major piece here moving forward, as does Aaron Altair, as does Aaron Nola. Then you look at AAA. Rhys Hoskins has been hitting all year, a guy who has a higher ceiling than Tommy Joseph, a guy who I expect to be up at some point over the next few weeks, even if Tommy Joseph is not traded, because the Phils are going to want to get to see about 150 to 200 at-bats of Hoskins to know what they have heading into next year. Scott Kingery's been lighting it up all year, AA and AAA second baseman who, again, higher ceiling than the Phillies' current second baseman in Cesar Hernandez. There's the outfield prospects, guys like Dylan Cousins, who has a ton of power, but there's a big swing and miss flaw in his offensive approach. The Phillies have a lot of intriguing young guys that we've been hearing about for a while, and the one that can't be dismissed here is J.P. Crawford, the consensus top prospect in his organization for years, who had a really rough start to this season, the first 2.5 months under the Mendoza line, but he is just red hot lately. Over his last month, he's hitting .289. An OPS close to 1,000. He had an inside the park grand slam last night, 19 extra base hits in his last 33 games, and that's a huge sign for the Phillies because they wanted to see Crawford's power develop a little bit, and now he kind of is back to looking like an elite prospect.
How about that slide, by the way? You saw the slide?
Yeah, it was one of the strangest plays I've ever seen. I have no idea what the catcher was doing. It's almost like the catcher froze and got scared and didn't know what to do, and Crawford just slides right under him.
Hey, Corey, it's Josh Hennig. I want to ask you, you're running through a lot of the prospects and some of their, what they can and can't bring to the table. And I want to know, looking at the overall minor league system as a whole, obviously we're not sure if they have who they have yet because they haven't gotten to the major leagues. But outside looking in, do you think that they have enough talent at the minor leagues, or do you think they need to spend the next couple of years trying to accumulate more than they already have?
So that's a great question because no team gets to the top just by, using all of their prospects. Teams trade some prospects for veterans. Teams, infuse veteran presence with signings. So like I look at the Astros, for example, it took them years. And the final stage for them was bringing in veterans like Josh Reddick and Brian McCann and, Mike Fiers. They swung some under-the-radar trades. So those are the two pieces that the Phillies are going to need to do. We all know that they have money to spend. We all know about that 2018 free agent class that includes guys like Bryce Harper and Manny Machado, among others. But what is also going to be required from Matt Klentak is to make those under-the-radar transactions where, you get a diamond in the rough. You get like a hidden gem. I mean, you look at some of the moves the Astros have made. Marwin Gonzalez, their shortstop last night, a guy who has 20 home runs and a 984 OPS. They acquired him in 2011 from the Red Sox for a pitcher who's no longer even in affiliated baseball. He's now pitching in the Mexican League. So, those are the kinds of trades you need to make to really move the needle forward. No team just gets there based on picking high in the draft. It takes a lot more to really build a contender.
Do you think that Matt Klentak has done a better job at building and rebuilding and retooling the minor league system than his predecessors? Because you look at the fact that there was that whole transition. Amaro was still kind of there, and then McPhail came in. So there was some ambiguity about who was the trades. And you look at the baseball scene, they made no trades last year at the baseball deadline. And they finally make a trade this year. And I look at what they got back, like you mentioned, it's a lot of lottery picks. So do you think Klentak is doing a better job than his predecessor?
To this point, based on the moves that Matt Klentak has made, I can't say that he has, because, I think that it goes over a lot of people's heads that Ruben Amaro Jr. is really the one who, began this rebuild. I mean, yes, he held on to guys like Ryan Howard too long, Chase Utley probably a little bit too long. A lot of those veterans the Phillies held on to too long. But Ruben Amaro Jr. also made the Jimmy Rollins trade where he got Zach Eflin. He got Zach Eflin for a 36-year-old Jimmy Rollins who was pretty much done at that point. He got Ben Lively for Marlon Byrd, who I think played one more season in the majors. Yeah, the Cole Hamels trade, that was Ruben Amaro Jr.'s work as well. So those trades have turned out pretty well for the Phillies so far. I mean, Ben Lively and Zach Eflin, although they're both in AAA right now, we'll probably see them again over the next few weeks, especially if Jeremy Hellickson is traded. So, those are two potential back-end starting pitchers that you got for aging veterans who didn't have much left. So, I think we kind of underrate the job that Amaro did at the very end for all the mistakes that he made previous to that. And to this point, Matt Klentak really hasn't made a needle-moving trade. I mean, there was the Ken Giles to the Astros move where, I really liked it at the time because they were converting a 60-inning-per-year pitcher into a potential 180-inning-per-year pitcher from Giles to Vince Velasquez. But that trade hasn't exactly worked out the way the Phillies wanted. Mark Appel, the former number one overall pick, really stagnating at AAA. Tom Eshelman now on the DL, although he's pitched well. And Vince Velasquez, obviously, the jury's still out whether he's a starter or a reliever. So I can't say yet that Klentak has done a bang-up job, but I do kind of agree with some of the thought process that he's employed to date.
Corey Seidman with us, the Phillies beat reporter for CSN. You see him on Phillies pre and post, and you should follow him on Twitter at Corey Seidman CSN. That's Seidman CSN. So you talk about Matt Klentak, Corey, and a needle-moving type transaction or trade. Well, there's still names out there. We're not to the trade deadline yet, so I guess I'll go through with you the Howie Kendricks of the world, the Tommy Josephs of the world. Do you see those pieces moving on?
Howie Kendrick got hit by a pitch on the hand last night, and there was no fracture, but that might kind of ding his trade value here heading into Monday's deadline. But even if the Phillies don't trade him by Monday, he's an August trade candidate. After that's the post-non-waiver period where you have to put a guy on waivers first, and then he goes through, and if he's unclaimed, you can trade him anywhere. So Howie Kendrick, I would fully expect is going to be gone over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Not only because he has a lot of trade value, but because the Phillies need to open a spot back up in the outfield with, Aaron Altair, Nick Williams, and Odubel Herrera all seeing the ball well right now. Tommy Joseph, there's just no market for first baseman. That's, as simple as it gets. And even if there is a team that is seeking, a first baseman, like the Red Sox, for example, they have a hole in the middle of their order. They're not going to fill that hole with Tommy Joseph. I mean, they're going to fill that hole with a better player if they decide to make a trade. So, unfortunately for the Phils, they're probably not going to be able to open up that everyday first base spot for Rhys Hoskins this week or next week. They might have to bring Hoskins up and sit Joseph 4 or 5 days a week and give that playing time to Hoskins, and then, try to find another trade partner in the offseason when there are more teams that need a first baseman. But with Tommy Joseph, there are strengths that he has. He's a power hitter, and, he can, last night 2 doubles. I think he has like 15 or 16 home runs on the year. But in terms of first base production, he's just an average offensive first baseman.
Corey, there's been blockbuster talk floating around the Phillies as of late. Giancarlo Stanton has been subject of trade rumors that his contract could be dumped onto the Phillies' payroll. Are you really buying that the Phillies would actually take on Stanton and his humongous contract and kind of possibly interrupt the rebuild, or do you find that the Phillies might have some real interest there?
Well, it's tough. I mean, every team discusses every player. So, like, to see that report that the Phillies have had internal discussions about Stanton and Christian Yelich, it's not all that surprising. Of course they have. Every team does due diligence. But I think that the Phillies would really pursue Giancarlo Stanton if it was for the right price in terms of how much contract you'd have to take on and who you're giving up with to get Stanton, because he still owed $295 million of that $325 million contract he signed. It's not surprising that these reports are surfacing now, because the first 2 years of Stanton's 13-year deal were both pretty cheap years. I mean, we're talking like $6.5 million and $10 million. So Miami now, it looks like, is looking to perhaps unload his contract just as it starts getting really, really pricey. The reason that I would be in favor of the move for the Phillies is because, yes, I know Stanton, the last couple of years of that deal, he's probably going to be a shell of himself. It might be an Albert Pujols-like situation where he's hitting 240 and he can barely move and all that. But right now, he is a draw. He is a big-time power bat that could, if he ever stays healthy for a full season, and that's the big concern, the guy's going to hit between 40 and 50 homers. And the main thing for me is the Phillies have such little payroll space committed moving forward. Right now on their books for next season, they have Odubel Herrera's money, which is $3.5 million. They still owe Cole Hamels about $3 million that they're still paying from that contract, and that's it. And then when you incorporate, the arbitration raises and the guys making the league minimum, you're at about $30 million for 15 players. So even if you add, say, $25 to $30 million a year for Giancarlo Stanton, that still leaves you with a boatload of money that you can go spend on other free agents. If Stanton's contract was going to cripple the Phillies' ability to do that, I wouldn't be in favor of it. But when you have this much payroll space, it's something you really have to consider.
Corey, I was thinking about you saying that with Giancarlo Stanton, because I think back to trades the Phillies have made, and I look back to when they got Cliff Lee and all the guys they gave up in that Cliff Lee deal, and then the players they've given up in the Roy Halladay deal. And in some ways, a lot of those guys never panned out for those teams. Is there a possibility that if you're getting Giancarlo Stanton, it may look like it's actually hurting the rebuild, but it actually may be saving you in some ways from prospects that may never turn out?
Yeah, and I mean, that's really the case. That's often the case in baseball, that, there are prospects who don't pan out. Like, I go back to, remember the CC Sabathia trade to the Brewers in 2008, when the main piece going back to Cleveland was Matt Laporta, this first baseman who was viewed as a can't-miss, middle-of-the-order cleanup hitter, and he never amounted to anything. It was actually Michael Brantley, who was the second piece in that deal, that has been the mainstay in Cleveland. You mentioned the Phillies trades, like the Cliff Lee trade where they got him from Cleveland in 2009. The Phillies gave up Lou Marson and Jason Donald and Jason Knapp, and all three of them are out of baseball. They also gave up Carlos Carrasco in that deal, but it took Carlos Carrasco about 5 years until he became the pitcher that he is today. The Roy Halladay deal, Michael Taylor never amounted to anything, nor did Kyle Drabeck. So, yeah, there are plenty of examples where teams give up top prospects that don't pan out, and that's why they're called prospects. I mean, they're just guys until they do it at the major league level. So, I don't know if the Stanton thing is ever going to happen. It's definitely not going to happen, over the next couple of days, but it's certainly something to consider moving forward. And I don't even think that a team would have to part with like all of its top young talent to get him, because the Marlins would also be accomplishing the goal of, removing that massive debt from their payroll.
And just following that up, I look at a guy like J.P. Crawford, and part of me wonders, is he really going to pan out? Because he's struggled at AAA, he's been inconsistent. Is he maybe a candidate for that? We think he's going to be good, but if we trade him, we can avoid the possibility that he's the next Dominic Brown.
Yeah, I mean, with J.P. Crawford, I'll be honest. So for several years, I thought that his national ranking in terms of these prospect rankings, which, look, I mean, take it with a grain of salt. The prospect rankings you see at Baseball America or ESPN or MLB.com, they're not the same as teams' own internal rankings. But Crawford was like a top 10 guy for years, and it was because he plays a premium defensive position at shortstop. He has excellent, way beyond his years, plate selection. But beyond those two skills, there wasn't much that he showed that was like, oh, this is a can't-miss guy. And over the last calendar year at AAA, hitting about 230 with a 330 on base percentage. But, I still think J.P. Crawford's going to be a pretty useful player. Shortstop who can bat second in the lineup, take a lot of pitches, maybe hit you 280 with a 360 to 370 OBP if everything pans out. The thing is, right now, and this might have sounded crazy a year ago, but Freddie Galvis might be a little bit too valuable to get rid of because that is gold glove defense that he plays every single night at shortstop, which is extremely important for a young pitching staff. I mean, this guy makes every single play. He makes the tough plays. He makes the routine plays. He makes things look easy. And, especially if Galvis is going to hit you like 20 homers, he hit 20 last year, he's on pace for 19 this season. I mean, there's a lot of value in that. So it's going to be a really interesting situation moving forward at shortstop. Unfortunately for the Phils, a lot of their better prospects play at positions where they already have someone in the majors, first base, second base, shortstop.
Corey Seidman, this will wrap things up, Corey, by asking you about who has the tougher job, because there's been a lot of games. It's been well documented the number of one-run losses the Phillies have had this season. There are periods of time, not last night, where they go into hitting funks, and I think to myself, man, who has the harder job? Is it Matt Stairs, or is it the director of ticketing that has to try and put rear ends in the seats? On Tuesday night, they had 17,176 reported people there, and Mike Gill may be on vacation, but he and I have gone back and forth about, would you rather be the Sixers, where you admit you're terrible and this is what you're trying to build to, or the Phillies, where it's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain?
Well, I'm of the mind that fans will always come back once they feel like there's a good plan in place, once they feel like there's excitement that's going to be on the field. I expect that, like, if J.P. Crawford, for example, were to be called up, or if Rhys Hoskins were to be called up, I think you'd see a quick little surge there in attendance. I'm not saying they're going to sell out, but they would draw more than 17,000 that night. And then as the team gets better, the fans will come. I mean, I look at, like, the Sixers model. The Sixers, they didn't draw for years during this whole period, and now you look at it, and like almost every home game's already sold out. So I don't think that the whole putting butts in seats thing is a real problem for the Phillies. This is just the nature of having a team that is 30 games under 500. It's a tough job for everybody. I mean, Matt Stairs isn't working with a whole lot of offensive talent, and the Phillies marketing department isn't working with a whole lot of talent to get people to the ballpark just yet. But at least there is a plan in place. At least things aren't stagnant anymore. I mean, yes, the Phillies are 30 games under, but there are other franchises that they're in better shape than. Like, you look at like the Padres or the Giants. Those are teams where they don't have as much talent coming through the system. So in some ways, the Phillies rebuild could be quicker than some other cities just because they have a couple years of a head start on other cities.
A tough job, just like Corey Seidman has, describing the positive things about a team that's had a tough season. But we certainly enjoy watching you each and every night, Corey, and reading your material, too, on csnphilly.com. Thanks so much for being with us here, and we'll check in with you again. Maybe when we get to, like, that August date, right? That's the next significant. After the 31st, then there's the next significant dates in August.